Hey Chandler, how's it going?
I'm sick.
You're sick?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry to hear that. I'll try to have you not talk too much.
I think I'm presenting today, so I kind of gotta talk a little bit.
Okay.
It's
Try to
okay.
do your best. That's all you can do.
Yeah.
Hey Kashay, how are you?
Good evening. I'm well. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for asking. Hey Kyle, how's it going?
Doing great about yourself.
Pretty good. Pretty good.
Awesome.
All right, just waiting on a couple more people and we can start. All right, Maya, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Charles, how's it going?
I'm doing good, thank you. How are you?
Good, I'm good. Nicholas, how are you?
I'm good. Hope you're well.
Harpy, how's it going?
I'm doing good. How are you?
Good. Haneen, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Chloe, how's it going? Chloe, can you hear me? Not sure if she can hear me. Jasmine, how are you?
I'm really well. How are you today?
I'm good. You enjoying this weather?
Not too much. I'm down with COVID, so I'm stuck inside.
Oh, so sorry to hear that.
Yeah.
So you get pretty bad symptoms or?
It's more of a body physical. This time is my second time having it, so yeah, just feeling a little weak, but overall I'm well.
Okay. Chloe, can you hear me?
Hi, yes, I can hear you now. Sorry about
Okay.
that.
How's it going?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you doing?
Good, good. Madison, how are you?
Well, it's been a busy week. There's a lot of construction going on in my house, so it's just been really busy.
All right. All right, yeah, so sorry about last week. I got trapped out in South Lake Tahoe in California. So they've been having really bad snow and weather and all of that. And it just kind of hit hard when I was there. So really disrupted everything. So yeah, we're gonna kind of skip that chapter. We'll come back to it a later date. And so we'll focus on chapter 10 today, culturally adapted and culturally centered approaches. But we're going to begin off. We got a presentation. Who all is left? How many, who all needs, so just got two groups. Okay, we got two groups left. So we got two groups presenting today. And Chandler, would your group like to go first? Okay, well,
Yeah.
yeah. You could your group could take it away and show us what you get.
So it's just me and Jasmine.
Okay. So maybe someone could speak first before Chandler, or is your part coming up first? Because you have a code going on.
Yeah, we both got COVID. I don't know how that happened, but
Yeah.
Jasmine, do you want to share on your screen or do you want me to share on mine?
Let me see here. Hold on. Okay, can you all see my screen okay?
Yep, I can see
Okay.
it.
Okay, so we're doing our presentation on, sorry, can you go back one? Mental health in Asian America and a focus on depression in East Asian communities. Next one. So mental health among Asians. When I was reading about mental health among Asian Americans, I found a study that looked at like the various mental health concerns that were kind of happening within Asian American communities. The most common sources of stress that affected, or that I found that affected their overall mental health was parental pressure to succeed in academics, discussing mental health concerns, because it's considered taboo in a lot of Asian cultures, and it tends to be dismissed, denied or neglected, and their symptoms tend to be dismissed, denied or neglected. Pressure to live up to the model minority stereotype, which is a view that inaccurately portrays Asian Americans as successfully integrating into mainstream culture and having to overcome the challenges of racial bias. Family obligations based on strong traditional cultural values, discrimination due to racial or cultural background, and then lastly, difficulty in balancing two different cultures and developing a bicultural sense of self. So those are just kind of the main concerns that seem to, trigger more mental health concerns among Asian Americans. It was interesting because I found a lot of inconsistencies in the prevalence of mental health issues in the Asian American community. Some studies showed that there's a greater severity in mental health disorders among this population, while others said there was low prevalence and severity. It kind of explained too that there's like a big underrepresentation in care in Asian American populations, and those who use services may have a delay in services. So that could mean that they only seek professional help when problems become very serious. So that leads to like the high prevalence results. But then the ones that says it's low, yeah, this research is very different. You can go to the next slide. So some mental health statistics. The National Latino and Asian American Study found that the overall lifetime prevalence of any psychiatric disorder among Asian Americans was 17.3%, and the 12-month prevalence was 9.91. It was found, or in this study, it was found that overall Asian Americans had a lower prevalence rate than other ethnic groups. The prevalence of major depression was found at a 19.6%, which was higher than predominantly white populations. Research has highlighted that Southeast Asian refugees suffer from high rates of psychiatric disorder even after decades of resettlement in the US. And just because in these populations there was a high exposure of trauma and violence, 62% of these respondents had PTSD and 51% had major depression. It was also found that while Asian Americans have lower suicide rates which is 6.24 over 100,000 compared to 14.31 per 100,000 in non-Hispanic whites. There's an 8.6% prevalence for suicidal ideation and 2.1 for attempt. So overall, like the suicide rate is really low in these communities. And then for mental health and coping, it was found in another study that a lot of young Asian Americans tend to seek out support from personal networks such as close friends, family members, and religious community members instead of seeking professional help for mental health concerns. This is because, like I've kind of said before, there's a really negative stigma surrounding mental health issues in these communities, as well as a large lack of awareness of the resources and services available to them. When I was reading, it said that the language barrier contributes to the lack in services and access to mental health services. Says there's a very limited English proficiency and the lack of language proficiency service providers. It was found that Asian Americans have the lowest rates of service utilization and help seeking behavior. Go to the next one. And then in one of the articles that I was reading, it kind of talks about the difference in Western cultures and Eastern cultures, especially when it came to depression. It said Western cultures have a Cartesian dualism, which is mind and body is separate. The psychology and psychiatry deal with disorders of the mind and emotions, while somatic medicine treats body and its disorders. It was saying that it can be controversial since disorders in the DSM classify as somatic components. And then as for depression, Westerners can feel sadness or depressed mood. And then in Eastern cultures, it has an emphasis on somatic symptoms with holistic representation of mind and body together and not separate. As for depression, they may experience depression in regards to body and mind, which can explain somatic symptoms with headaches, fatigue, insomnia, which can bring people to their primary physician instead of going to psychologist. So they might not be diagnosed with depression and could be just treated for their somatic symptoms. Sorry, I don't know. My dog is drinking water on it. And then it said in a study done on depressive symptoms among Chinese participants, it was found that somatic symptoms were more accepted within the community because of the assumption that a cure could be found. And then you can go to the next one.
Okay, so focusing a little bit more on depression, we found that nativity is an influencing factor for depressive symptoms. And so a study conducted on Chinese Americans showed that US-born Chinese Americans have higher rate of major depressive disorder as well as dysthymia than Chinese immigrants. Researchers also observed that Chinese Americans seek professional help at lower rates than Chinese immigrants. And some of those key differences within the populations are, as we previously stated, informal coping, which is the reliance on friends and families to cope with it comes to adapting and dealing with worries and additional mental health problems. US-born Chinese Americans rely on family to cope with mental health symptoms, and then going in addition into family conflict. While immigrant populations have significant stressors, Chinese Americans show higher rates of conflict within the family unit. And then also the last key difference is personal values. So Chinese immigrants reported to value virtues such as selflessness, and therefore in environments where there is little control, they do not perceive themselves as completely helpless. The study did not really go into religion or spiritual beliefs. However, I'd be very curious to see how that was to impact their personal values.
And then I wanted to add just one more thing to this slide. In one of the studies that I found in one of the articles, it was on the prevalence of lifetime depression in Taiwan and Korea, which was 1.5% and 2.9 as opposed to 5.2 in the United States. It was found that maybe the low prevalent rates in Taiwan and Korea may indicate differences in reporting of distress or even possible protective effects of family and social support. So it just may not be reported, and that's why it seems like it's so much lower. And then in terms of treating depression, it was found that Asian Americans within the past year, with a past year depressive disorder, were less likely to access any treatment or adequate care compared to non-Latino whites. And kind of like I said before, so if they do suffer from depression, they may less likely have the disorder treated and detected, which can result in the worst prognosis.
And additionally, immigrant status also increases chances of developing depressive symptoms. So we have factors such as acculturative stress, social isolation, culture shock, as well as having low English proficiency, which also creates challenges for any immigrant who is moving to the United States. High levels of stress resulting from cultural adaptation also result into higher levels of medical disability for Asian immigrants. And so in Asian communities, gender roles have a large influence in depressive symptoms. According to the future research, men are under much pressure and this highly impacts their mental health. So interestingly, men are highly vulnerable regardless of migration status. US-born Asian men are experiencing what is referred to as gender racism. So gender racism is the assumption that being of Asian origin makes them weaker in comparison to US white males. I'm sorry, hold on, I need water.
Yeah, take your time.
Oh, okay. So not only does the gender racism increase their depressive symptoms and feeling of hopelessness, they're reported to have more external shame placed on their family. And men who are reported to experience gender racism are also experiencing high levels of alcohol use and at severe risk for alcohol use. Men and women are both experiencing depressive symptoms related to immigrant status. Specifically for men, some of the influential factors for their depressive symptoms are marital status. So the pressure to not only take care of their existing family, but if they're of single relationship status, developing a family. Education level, considering that some of their academic credits don't transfer, and then income level. Okay. Oh, wait, I think I forgot something. Hold on here. Okay. So immigrant women tend to experience more depressive symptoms based on age of arrival in the United States. Women under the age of 18 experience more depressive symptoms than older immigrant women. Additionally, women born in the United States have more reports of mental health symptoms. Interestingly, much of the research report that women served as kind of like the social support providers. They really aided in that informal coping, as we previously mentioned. But women were not the primary focus in many of these studies. And with this, it really suggests that there's much more to know about Asian women and their experiences of mental health. Okay, so going into treatments and interventions. So while treating East Asian Americans for depression, cognitive behavior therapy showed a drastic reduction in depressive symptoms. But when compared to other ethnicities, Asian Americans respond much better to treatment that is culturally appropriate. So treatment supports that are culturally tailored to Asian culture enhance the treatment outcomes for not only Asian Americans, but Asian immigrants. The language barrier often impacts Asian Americans' ability to seek treatment. Therefore, having bilingual support better serves this community. Some suggestions for effective treatment include addressing family conflict, should there be any, strengthening the quality as well as the appropriateness of informal. So this goes back to addressing some of that informal coping. and then as well as increase in social support. And the research suggests that this is very important for East Asian men. And that concludes our presentation.
All right, excellent job. Excellent job. Any questions? There's got to be some questions there.
I have a question. I know you said the bulk of your research was mainly focusing on the male generations, but do you think that if they were to pay the females more attention, like I guess the combination of the both, that they could help each other, and that the mental status could drop a little more because they're leaning on each other instead of separating themselves?
You know, that's a really good question. And I really think that that support will definitely benefit, because it seems like with the male population, they are experiencing much more social isolation than the women. And so, of course, but I think the issue is that because the number of mental health issues, as well as the type of mental health disorders that women are experiencing, is kind of underreported, we wouldn't really know the gap and really how to collaborate. But my personal suggestion, I think that would definitely be something helpful for the specific population.
And when it comes to the children, did y'all read anywhere of where it stated the mental status on the children, whether the parents or the male or the woman, whichever one had mental issues that was reported or not, how was the mental status on the children?
We didn't really find any research on kids. It mainly was like college and above. So when we were looking at, populations and ages and genders, and there really wasn't like much at all that we could find studies on. I'm sure they're out there, but not that we could find.
Anyone else? Questions? All right, so one of the questions I had in doing the research, being that Asia is the largest continent in the world, and there's still a host of diverse set of distinct cultures, whether it's in sort of the Orient, the Far East, or maybe dealing with Indian cultures and subcultures versus maybe say Arab and Semitic cultures. Your research mostly focuses on the Far East. You think most of the individuals coming from the Far East? When you were looking into the research, did you find a lot of distinct characteristics, or did you find like a lot of commonalities from people from different cultures, whether it be Vietnamese, Cambodian, Malaysia, Philippines, Chinese? Was it like specific countries or cultures you saw against, or was the research kind of more lumped into just Far East?
It was. I was just gonna say, it was a little bit of both. That's why I wanted to include like percents on like Taiwan, Korea. Then we had stuff on China. Some research kind of lumped all East Asian together. Some of them separated them. Some of them separated them into immigrants. Some of them didn't. It was just kind of like a wide range, while some of them was just, a lot of our research was mainly kind of lumped East Asian together, while the other ones just kind of gave like certain statistics on Taiwan or Taiwanese, like Korean, Chinese. So some of the research, but all in all, it was all pretty similar in numbers when it came to the different cultures. There wasn't a huge difference. The only big difference was when I was kind of talking about, let me go back up. When I was talking about Southeast Asian refugees, that was when it was like the super high numbers of like PTSD and depression. That's when the numbers kind of shot up. But other than that, it was all pretty similar in the numbers.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention. significant difference came from migration status. So whether they were an American born versus like migrating here, refugees, or any of that type of identifying status.
Yeah, we thought it was really interesting because when it talked about immigrants versus like American born, it was interesting because it was saying that mental health was higher in, like, mental health issues was higher in American born people in the Asian American born people in the Asian country versus immigrants, which I thought was interesting. So that's kind of some of the differences.
Any sort of kind of takeaways as to why you think that is?
Go ahead.
Just as a guess for me, just thinking about cultural adaptation. There are many significant differences when you think about East versus Western culture, whether it's spiritual, whether it's, you know, the value and even level of competitiveness and scarcity for various resources. So I would definitely think it's the cultural adaptation aspect.
So there's probably a lot more social pressure to be more Americanized if you are born here, as opposed to if you came here at a later time in life, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Like you might be pretty much like, you know, settled within your cultural adaptation of like, you know, this is my culture, this is where I'm from. And then when you're born here, it's like, am I American? Am I part of this other culture? So I'm guessing that definitely does have a big impact.
Yeah, and if you're born here, probably maybe a little bit more susceptible to be open to try to figure out America and the different cultures and where you kind of fit, which is a lot of pressure.
That's what I was thinking too, that maybe American born, like they're more likely to report it too, because they kind of grew up in a society that mental health is a little bit more accepted. So that's why it might seem like the mental health issues are a lot more just because it's reported a little bit more.
All right, excellent. Why did you choose depression?
When we were looking, we kind of went back and forth for a long time on which population, which culture, and it seemed like that was more what we could find the most research on, because when we tried to get really specific, it was really difficult to find more research, and plus with depression, you know, that's a very wide known mental health disorder, and it was we kind of wanted to see like the difference with East Asian, and you know, because depression here is very common. So we just kind of wanted to see that difference, and again, mainly the research was a lot more, we could learn a lot more.
Okay. And yeah, it's interesting. I like that you mentioned Cartesian dualism versus sort of mind and body being one single organism in the East. You know, so that kind of opens up a whole array of challenges, because that's just a huge ideological sort of perspective on how we exist and interact with the world, you know. So I like that part you mentioned. And what else? All right, how could you apply what you've researched to maybe some personal therapy in the future for working with these communities? Like, what are some of the takeaways of what you've learned to apply with these communities?
I think the main thing is, do you want to go first, Jasmine?
Oh, you could go.
I think the main thing is kind of knowing, like when I was learning about like the main concerns that lead to mental health issues, I think just knowing those, and like knowing that, like, of course their culture is different than mine, but I need to learn a little bit more about different cultures and learn too about like the struggles that they have even getting to mental health services. So kind of, you know, knowing to take that slowly and kind of build your way up, and really, really working on rapport. I think it's just kind of working with new cultures, and it kind of goes with every new culture, not just Asian American.
Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, the biggest takeaway was really understanding the informal coping that this community has. And so like if in any way I come across a client that is of East Asian descent, thinking about, is there a way that I can integrate family systems approach to really treat the entire unit and support them with healthy coping versus just looking at the individual. And as well as if there's any additional cultural appropriate adaptations I can make towards treatment. Really diving more into research and seeing how that can best be more beneficial for the client.
Excellent. Why do you think there's a lower suicide rate for Southeast Asian men versus their white male counterparts?
That's a good question. I was thinking it might be like a religious aspect, maybe. Like just that might not be like one of the like a coping. I mean, obviously it's not really coping, but I think it might just be because isn't most Asian cultures is it Catholic? I couldn't really find that on religious, or I'm not really sure, but it might just be a religious factor, maybe.
So you're saying religion may play a huge issue over no matter how bad it gets. Suicide.
Yeah, I think. I'm not sure, that's just a guess.
Okay. What about you, Jasmine? Any inclination on that?
Yeah, I was leaning more towards the personal values and just how the community views challenges and going back to that piece about helplessness. So I really think it's something ingrained in spiritual beliefs, but the research didn't really dive into that, but I would primarily guess that it had a huge influence on suicidal rates.
Okay. What did you mention? Dysthymia, Jasmine?
Dysthymia.
Dysthymia, yeah. So what do you think about that? I think typically that's like chronic depression, right?
Yeah.
More than 2 years. And they believe that maybe there's potential like chemical imbalances that has to go with that. So yeah, I have to think about that. That's an interesting one, chronic depression. And what was another thing picked up? Oh, language barrier. Yeah. So language barrier, you mentioned that was like a big one, right?
Mhm.
And I think one other thing to consider, even if it is American-born Southeast Asian culture individuals, as it is with any other culture that's potentially people born here. When we think of language barriers, not always just like, oh man, I don't understand the language per se, right? But it's more so I don't understand the expression. So I think sometimes when we think of language barriers, we just like, oh, I don't speak that language. Then that may not be the case. We may speak the same language. But since we come from a different culture, we may have different expressions and different meanings to those expressions and different sort of concepts to those expressions. So which makes language a huge sort of problem, whether we actually speak the language or a dialect of it, or we just express ourselves and shape our worldview differently based on different words, right? We hear the same word, but we don't see it the same way. You know, I'm pretty sure all of us have the experience just traveling around this country, how, you know, certain things sound the same, but they don't mean the same.
I think too with the language barrier, there in East Asian cultures, there's so many different languages. Like it's not like in America, like the main one is like English, Spanish. So there's a big range of those. But in East Asian cultures, there's so many different languages that I'm sure there's just so many limited resources that have all those different languages.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a host of languages and dialects and within any of those countries that people may come from in Southeast Asia. Okay, any other questions from the class? All right, well, excellent. Thank you, guys. That was an excellent presentation. We will now move on to, you know what I think we'll do? Let's do breakout rooms first and have a little bit of discussion to break it up so we won't have two presentations right back to back. That way we could give ourselves some time to take a break, answer some questions, and then after we kind of have our discussions, we'll work on our last presentation. Sounds good? All right.
Okay, so can I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
After hearing the presentation and thinking about the readings and doing the immersion exercise that we did, if we get a client in our office that is not of our culture, not of the things that we know and understand, how exactly do we go about preparing ourselves to help them, especially if there's a language barrier? I mean, like you said, we might speak the same, but interpret differently. And then like the religion aspect of it and just a cultural period. I mean, do we like just take ourselves and actually go and study that cultural? I mean, tell me the connection of helping a person out. Am I making any sense?
Yeah, no, I get what you're saying. I mean, because it all sounds challenging. It almost sounds like a hodgepodge of multiple things. But really, even when we're going to discuss this chapter, what we are using primarily when we do anything in the field that we are in, we're using evidence-based practices, which means there is research out there that has been done. We have to find it for particular types of groups of people. All right, that's step one. Step two is I need to find out what's important. Is culture the important thing for this individual that I'm about to try to help? And how important is their culture to it, right? The other part is just their personality, you would say persona, or what you say characteristics, which we'll talk about also too in this chapter. So there's a few things happening. One, people have their persona, right? Which makes up their character, which is influenced by culture and environment and nurturing nature, all of the above. Two will be the cultural aspect, right? Because it is a huge, huge force to people. We, all of us in this class, the way that we express ourselves, what we believe in, our politics, where we choose to live, all of the above is a lot of it is adapted from our culture, right? So people cling on to their culture. If I would ask any of you any questions about your culture and some things you do in your personal lives, I could probably put one and one together and be like, oh, okay, I see culture's been highly influential on how you go about your life and what you believe in and how you think the world should be, right? Whatever worldview you have. So first we got our personalities, our individual, deep down, things that are kind of unshakable. I would say things that are in the automatic processes of the human body. The other part is the part where we are influenced by, that's the cultural part. And the third part is the research. We got the research out there. The fourth part is the biggest part is you as an individual therapist. We're not gonna all approach our patients the same way, right? My approach may be completely different because we're all different types of people. And so we got to learn how to try to blend kind of about 4 different things to try to help people to get down to the root cause. I would say probably the easiest way is talking, having a conversation, or you could maybe say CBT methods, which is questions and answers, kind of diving deep in. So we're researching on one hand, we're having a conversation to try to figure out significance, importance, and relevance of different facets of people's lives, right? And how that's shaping their issues that they're coming to us for. The other part, we're trying to figure out who these people are just as an individual, besides you wipe away all the culture, religion, all that stuff. And using our own personal methodologies. So like we almost, some way, each one of us will come up with our own sort of models, right? Our own sort of approach. And it may change for different cultures, or we may have one that we just kind of do the same old thing for each person. But so it's multi-factor. Why? Because life is multi-factor. It is extremely challenging. And now we've added, I think with global focus on culture, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion, culture, mental health, all being blended in. This is becoming big. Yeah, we're kind of on the cusp of figuring it out, how to really truly help people. Because it's already complicated enough if someone's from our culture. We've added another layer of trying to figure out people based on religious beliefs, traditions, values, acceptance of mental health, ideologies, all this stuff. So it's multi-factor. It's extremely layered. The point is to kind of add everything we kind of learned so far to all make it make sense so that we can apply everything to kind of create our own theoretical models, create our own framework, essentially, to help people. And I think really that's truly the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is each one of you should, think about a particular framework for maybe a particular type of culture that you think you can help serve best, right? Or if you want to be, multicultural, you could think of frameworks for different types of cultures. But yeah, so to answer your question, I say it's a little bit of old and a little bit of new, and kind of what are you going to do to add on what you've learned and picked up throughout all your education thus far to create your own sort of framework for helping people. So I think that's kind of what it's like. But great question. That's an excellent question, Kashin. All right, let's get into groups. I'll give us about 15 minutes. So it's 42 after. Maybe we'll come back at right at the hour. So give us about 15 minutes. So I'm gonna see you in the groups right now. I'll see you in a few. All right, welcome back. Was it Kyle, Jasmine, and Maya? What did you discuss?
I had brought up a question that we started with, and it was in chapter 7. The excerpt was clinical practice tends to reflect dominant cultural views and to ignore multicultural worldviews. And I kind of brought up like how the DSM, like when there's new diagnoses to be added and diagnostic material, they update it every X years. So why can't we kind of update our own, psychology curriculum or something to come from a more multicultural world lens?
Oh, you're just saying just as a curriculum
and just like with our research and our theories and stuff now, I know we do come up with stuff, but I know a lot of it is based on very old information.
Yeah, I mean, and what was your assessment of that or your analysis of as to why things are moving so slowly?
Well, Jasmine brought up a good point about how there will be maybe hesitancy on, or it could go like we kind of basically, I don't know if Jasmine, you want to help me, but basically we had just talked about how you might get very opposing reactions to that.
Yeah, and a point that I brought up is really thinking about the DSM from a worldview standpoint versus like dominant culture perspective. It made me curious as to how we will rethink maladaptive behavior and possible impairments. And then we went into further discussion, and I thought about like considering that there may be extremist groups based off of like who currently is in a position of a dominant culture and who may want to keep things as they are, especially from a psychological standpoint. Makes me feel as a clinician that it's my duty to approach the work from a multicultural and worldview perspective, the best way that I can to serve clients from all different perspectives.
Excellent. I probably would agree with that. I think that's kind of up to us at this point to kind of dictate how we're going to help people who are from multicultural backgrounds. Kyle, anything you want to add?
Yeah, we also mentioned with that question, what types of therapies we're kind of attracted to based on, the multicultural worldview and things like that. And I kind of threw out Gestalt therapy just on the premise that, Gestalt is studying or treating the person as a whole. And, when you get a person who, client that comes in who has whatever issues, you're looking at their culture and where they came from and all those other characteristics about that person. And I always felt it worked really well into the Gestalt type of therapy, just based on that right there. But,
yeah, I mean, I think that's probably a good practice. I think oftentimes we can become kind of wrapped up in too much maybe academic and scholarly approaches, almost to a point of neuroticism. Like, we become too neurotic about it, that we do tend to lose sight on the actual needs of a particular individual, whole person, like you're saying, right? That we get wrapped up too much, oftentimes in the literature, right? And we may come to find out that there's stuff in the literature that really won't help this particular case or situation. Thus, we are the people who have to kind of create research as we move along, helping people, right, doing therapy. So it's a very interesting perspective. Yes, does the dominant culture for anything wants to hold on to sort of the paradigms, the way that things are? Yeah, there's probably a lot of reasons. A lot of it could be A lot of our approaches are institutionalized. A lot of them do have domains of control. Speaking of like the DSM and the committees that forms it and who decides on what's going to go into it. I'd probably say there is still a lack of clear agreement and understanding on, because we say I'm multicultural, you're like, hey, this is a pretty big world. So it's a lot of people, a lot of indigenous tribes, indigenous populations, and we're talking cross-cultural people who live in maybe 2 countries or more. So it's complex, but I think it's just going to take time. But for the stuff that's not out there in the literature or don't fit the DSM's sort of schedule on things, then yeah, there are things that we have to just approach it in a personal way, using best judgments. And ultimately, I think that's kind of how this sums up. I think it sums up by using your better judgment for any of the models or theories or concepts that we're learning. At the end of the day, you're going to have to use your best judgments on how to sort of approach to help people from different backgrounds. Okay, Arpi, Chloe, Haneen, what you talk about?
We kind of talked about a lot of things, but mainly Haneen and I shared a question. I can go ahead and talk about mine first. It was in the Comas Diaz reading. It stated that clients from diverse cultural backgrounds may be relevant to engage in traditional Western psychotherapy. So my question was, why might this be the case, and what are some strategies that clinicians can use to address this reluctance? So I kind of said it's possibly because I feel like the research that's done to come up with the psychotherapy is kind of looking at the dominant culture. And, Chloe had said that typically it's white college students is what the research is done on. So as someone who's a part of a different culture, it's kind of like if I go to this therapist, they're not going to understand me, or the treatment options they give me is just not going to work for me or make a difference. Or if they have tried out the treatment methods, it's not working, they're taking steps backwards for probably different matters. And it's kind of like within you, you're like, I'm the problem, I'm not doing something right. But in reality, it's just your treatment method is not fitting your culture. I kind of gave an example of, I've been to a therapist where, I had talked about not feeling independent, which is kind of typical within my culture being a girl, where it's like until you're married, you're kind of living with your parents. And I was told to just move out. So there was no way for me to kind of advance through the treatments or, make a difference. So for me, it was culturally, these options I'm given are not working.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if Haneen, you wanted to share your question.
Yeah, I can share. My question was a bit more general, and then Arpi's kind of followed it. But the main question that I had was, when we were talking about culturally adapted versus culturally centered treatment, is there any research on which of the two is more effective, or the difference between the two? Because I know culturally adapted interventions are kind of more universal to many cultures, but culturally centered is more very specific. So just kind of the difference between the two interventions and whether or not one is different. I think we kind of came to the conclusion that it is more of a case-by-case basis, but maybe if there was just other ideas about that.
Yeah, idea would be, how important is the culture relevant to the issues that a person is experiencing? So if we say, hey, first we want to deal with issues dealing with depression, antisocial personality disorder, any of the sorts, we have a lot of research to support that from a general perspective, right? We could say this is a common thing that human beings experience, and these are the typical symptoms or comorbidities, et cetera, et cetera. Now, if we say, hey, and after having discussions with our client, we find that their culture right? The facets of the culture are extremely important in dictating these disorders, right? Which case we would say, well, maybe that context really matters, right? So we would say that's more of the culturally responsive counseling that we would need, right? But cultural adaptation would be more on the general side. We're like, all right, this seems to be a very common thing happening for a particular group of people. This makes it a little bit more simpler to approach. Let's see if this works, right? You try it, you see if there's some positive outcomes. If not, then you need to change your strategy, right? Now you got to be a little bit more specific, look at the context of how much the culture matters, the values, the traditions, the religious beliefs, systems, the anxieties of, dealing with a different culture, a dominant culture of some sort. So yeah, I think it's case by case, but it's, it may be fluid. It may have to use both at a different point in time in therapy, right? One may come before the other in some approach, or you may only use one. So, but it's definitely context dependent. How prevalent is culture and the facets of culture dictating a particular issue for a person? Because we may find later on that it actually was not the case, right? It wasn't as strong as we maybe presume or hypothesize it to be. So is there evidence to support either one? Not necessarily. There's not really to say which one is more useful than the other. I say it's really still a case by case basis. Also, too, to go back what you were saying, Arpi, is two things happening, right? Two things happen. We have our client, and our client may have a multicultural dimension to themselves. Now, it's a two-way street, right? We as therapists have our dimensions. So I think one of the most important things we overlook is that, particularly why we come to this sort of time and place where everyone's focusing on culture, is that we inherently as human beings have biases. So the therapist is biased to the DSM, biased to their Western education, biased to their Western approach, biased to whatever culture they belong to on a personal level, right? Biased to their religious beliefs that they subscribe to, biased to their orientation. They're biased, right? So the therapist is biased. So what's the point of learning all this is to try to understand how to help clients by learning more about cultures and what makes us all different and unique and how important those things are to us. The other part is trying to dig deep down inside to remove our personal bias so that we're able to see the world in a new light. So it's kind of like pulling off the sheets or the curtains or whatever, like you trying to lift a veil as an individual, as a therapist, to say, hey, let me start to tend to see the world a little bit different than how I was either educated or taught or conditioned or any other sort. So part of it is really examining self. So I said some sort of self-examination and say, hey, I think I look at the world a little bit too monolithic. This is a very complex world. People have extremely different viewpoints other than myself, and they see the world extremely different than maybe I do. Thus, how am I able to help people who have these differences? So I said we probably have one of the toughest jobs out there of trying to do that. It's definitely not easy, but I think when you start to analyze it from that point, it even makes it more interesting, because you may really do some sort of meta-analysis or meta-thinking. You're thinking about your own thoughts and why you think in kind of biased approaches to other people. So. Okay, and Chloe, did you want to add something to that?
I think what I was kind of just talking about that I thought was interesting was like
how, like we were talking a lot about like the research, and I know in this last conversation we were just talking about like how you can get kind of lost in all the research, but it just is interesting how so much of the research is conducted on actually like undergraduate psychology students that who are like in college. And it just is such a different like demographic than people that would benefit from psychology research. So it just, when looking at like culturally attuned treatments and you know, just even just like different like psychology interventions that work, what's really out there and like the evidence that's out there isn't multiculturally inclusive. So I think that's just like kind of what we're a little bit of like what our conversation was too, is just kind of like talking about, you know, like as a therapist, how do you even like, how do you know what the right thing is to do sometimes when so much of our research isn't generalizable to so many people? And like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand it. So me teaching at universities, so each university psychology department has a lab, and typically that laboratory always sorts of put out surveys and questionnaires, right? And want students to always engage in this because it's really kind of free research for the university, right? It makes it free research for the university to kind of get some sort of data, maybe for the researchers or the professors to be able to publish some of that stuff. And it's probably easily accessible. So like, well, there's information to be gotten here from the students. The students may hopefully have a diverse population. So the validity or reliability of these questionnaires or surveys are, you know, they're pretty good. And we can apply them in some way that seems to be able to be beneficial, right, for public consumption of some sort. I think that's probably one of the reasons, right? Easily available, students are there. The laboratories need research constantly conducted. So I would say it's really just the accessibility part. That's what makes it so prevalent. Yeah, it may be unfortunate that you say, well, a particular demographic is represented more than maybe more diverse demographics than others. But really, if, you know, if we're doing our job as educators and as institutions of trying to get people through to become therapists, hopefully that's where you all take the lead and start doing your own independent research, peer-reviewed stuff, and get the stuff out there. So I say it's sort of a process. A lot of it is skewed. A lot of it doesn't, you know, make the most sense, but that kind of is what it is. All right, who we got last? Chandler, Madison.
Yeah, I might make this a little bit quick. My throat's hurting a little bit, but so we just kind of discussed what we read in chapter 7. It was just about like the multicultural view and kind of how like the mistrust that multicultural populations can feel to therapy, and how we as therapists can like help, as we as therapists can make them more trusting and to, you know, therapy. And we were just discussing how important empathy is. I know we've talked about it in this class a million times, how we can support multicultural communities, but we were just talking about how empathy is really important. And like, even if we haven't fully been through the same experiences that people in multicultural populations have, like we can still have that empathy, and we can still, you know, even like saying like, you know, like, because it's like, let's say they say like, well, you don't understand, you're not in this culture. You can say like, you're right, I don't understand, but I still hear you. Like I hear you, and like, you know, that's hard. So still kind of having that empathy and you know, still providing that support without kind of skipping over, you know, the adversities and, you know, different issues that multicultural populations can have.
Yeah, and sort of just adding on to that, we sort of talked also a little bit like how, empathy can sort of transcend some of the trans and multicultural issues. Like if someone's bringing an issue into therapy, you don't necessarily, as the therapist, need to have had that experience to validate and empathize and connect with them. You can kind of go into your own experiences and find a feeling that's similar versus an experience that's similar. So connecting on like the emotional level versus the like experiential level was kind of what we talked about, like how we as therapists could sort of use what we've learned from our readings and stuff this week.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, compassion and empathy and using relative experiences, I think, forms connections. And it's all really about trying to form a connection with your client on particular issues. There's an interesting quote from one of the economists that I like. It's probably one of the most famous of all time, Milton Friedman. And he says, you don't ask your oncologist if he's had, it doesn't matter if your oncologist has had cancer, right? If someone's treating you for cancer, they don't necessarily would have had cancer themselves, right? But you still want to go see the specialist irregardless of such. And because he knows what he's doing and he knows what he's talking about, right? He's had the training and practice of it. Doesn't mean he's had cancer to know cancer. He's treating it because he knows about it very well. Okay, and lastly, we get Cachet, Nicholas, and Charles. What'd you discuss?
Yeah, so we actually ended up mostly talking about Cachet's question that she asked at the end of the presentation about sort of like situations where like extreme situations of cultural differences. And I think she used bilingual, or sorry, not bilingual, but just difference in language as being an example of that. Yeah, I think the main thing for me is we were sort of thinking about it, not even from the angle of like, how do we show up to that, but like, should we even try to? Like, are there instances where it would actually be best for the client to advocate for them to go see a different therapist who speaks their language or some other thing like that? And then Cachet actually was like, she mentioned it's almost like in these extreme situations, us as therapists, we're learning cultural sensitivity and awareness and learning how to have these conversations, but also like the client is kind of like a guinea pig in that instance. And is that actually doing them a service or a disservice and that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you absolutely do not speak the language, you're not going to serve anybody well, right? So although there are translating tools and maybe even a translator that can help in that situation, it could be beneficial. Once again, just because someone goes to someone who speaks the same language, that therapist may be lacking in a lot of areas and skill that may potentially not do any help for an individual, even though they speak the same language. So I would say it really is context dependent. Like, does the client want the help of a certain individual? They may still request to see you, right? And they say, oh, okay, we're going to use Google Translate or something, right? We're going to use something. Maybe you're doing telehealth, right? Talking to someone from a foreign country, or you're talking to someone from another state, something of the sort. And maybe there's a language barrier, maybe expression, but maybe you can work through it because the client may want to still see you. They may feel attached to you and like talking to you. But if it's expressed that this is not going to work from the client's perspective, yeah, then of course you move on, right? Or you assess that, hey, the language barrier is too distinct, it's too much, that I'll probably do you an injustice as opposed to, serving to help you correctly. So I think that it just kind of really depends, but there are tools to translate. And I've seen some experiences where the language, there was huge language barriers, but the client still wanted to speak with certain therapists. right? And just using translators or translating tools to help individuals. So I would say it's really dependent on the client, right? That depends on the client. All right, anything else? Charles, did you have something to add?
So basically, it just made me think about the presenting problem. So meaning, if someone came in and we don't know that culture, I might ask them like what their culture mean to them, and basically learn from them talking about their culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that is the perfect approach. You know, it's like, you know, it's continual conversation. What does this mean to you? And think about that as a therapist, that makes you so much more of a better therapist overall, whether you're a multicultural therapist or you're not a multicultural therapist. Just overall, the types of questions that you can ask clients and the way that you ask to get to the root cause of what people have value towards, are emotional towards, that makes you a way better therapist than, you know, if you don't have those tools to ask certain questions, to pry, right? It's all about is kind of how you say, what you say, is a little bit of all of that together. But it's definitely getting to the root cause through sort of question and answers and assessing the answers to try to figure out the values in those answers and what they really truly mean. All right, 25 after the hour, let's go ahead and start our last presentation and we'll go from there.
I think it's my group presenting.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't decide who was going to screen share.
Okay.
I can otherwise.
Sure.
Okay, I'll do this. Give me 1 second just to get it up.
No worries. So we only got what? 2 weeks left? 3 weeks left? How much longer we got?
I think it's just next week.
Next week is our final week?
Yes.
No way. Oh man, that makes me sad. All right.
Can everybody see?
Yeah, I can see.
Okay, awesome. So, welcome to our presentation. This is culturally adapted research with Armenian children and mental health. We're sort of going to bounce around back and forth, and I think RP is going to take it first.
Yes, so as we'll kind of see like towards the other slides as well, something that's really important when looking at Armenian culture and mental health utilization and to adapt treatment is to look at the key values of the culture. So what's really important to them. So the first one's family and community. Armenians place a strong emphasis on family and community values. Family is the center of Armenian culture and a source of strength and support. Community ties are really important to them, so they'll often form close-knit communities based on shared cultural and religious traditions. Armenians are also known for their hospitality and generosity towards guests. So it's deeply ingrained within the culture, and often visitors are treated as honored guests, regardless if they know them or if they're strangers. And then resilience. Armenians have a long history of overcoming adversity and hardship, and this has led to a cultural value of resilience and determination. Armenians are known for their strength in the face of challenges, and this has been reflected in their art, music, and literature. So we also have patriotism. So Armenians are deeply proud of their history and cultural heritage, and this has led to a strong sense of national identity and patriotism. So the flag, national anthem, and other symbols of national pride are very important to Armenians around the world. And lastly, spirituality. Armenians have a long history of religious diversity, and this has led them to a strong sense of spirituality and connection to the divine. The Armenian Apostolic Church is the predominant religious tradition in Armenia, but there are also significant communities of Armenian Catholics and Armenian evangelicals. So next I'll talk about the limitations on expressing mental health concerns. So the first one, stigma and shame. Mental health concerns are often stigmatized in Armenian culture, and individuals who express these concerns may face shame or judgment from their family and community. There's also a lack of awareness within the community. Many individuals in the culture may not be aware of the signs and symptoms of mental health conditions, which limit their ability to express mental health concerns. This typically comes from, as I previously stated, the stigma and shame. So within the family and growing up, no one ever really speaks about mental health. Traditional beliefs and cultural norms are also part of the limitations. So traditional beliefs and cultural norms in Armenian culture may prevent individuals from seeking mental health care or expressing concerns. For example, some individuals may believe that mental health concerns are caused by supernatural or spiritual forces rather than biological or environmental factors. Lastly, there's a lack of access to care. There's limited access to mental health care in Armenia, which can also limit an individual's ability to express mental health concerns and seek treatment. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about some statistics on the utilization of mental health services. A study conducted in Armenia found that only 3.3% of the population had sought mental health services in the past year. Among those who had not sought services, the most common reasons cited were lack of perceived need and lack of availability of services. Another study was a survey where another survey of Armenian immigrants where it found in the United States, only 17% had ever sought mental health services. The reasons for this were stigma, lack of access to culturally responsive care, and mistrust of mental health professionals. Lastly, in a survey of Armenian university students, researchers found that mental health stigma was a significant barrier to seeking services. The participants reported concerns about being seen as weak or crazy if they sought mental health care, and many felt that their families would be embarrassed if they sought services.
So I'm going to be talking about, I think you missed one slide. Is it okay if we go back? Yeah. Oh, wait, never mind.
That's still me. No, sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Did I miss one?
I think you went too far down.
It kind of overclicked, my bad. There we go. Oh, now it's going backwards. Oh, I'm sorry, guys. 1 second. Okay, we're here. Apologies, guys. There we go.
Okay, so like RP said, that the cultural stigma of mental illness in Armenia, children with mental illness are hidden from the public due to the shame that it might bring to the family. And some actually believe that mental illness represents as a punishment from God instead of getting treatment. And the results from the stigma is maltreatment of and violence against children with mental illnesses. Mental illness is also often considered untreatable in Armenia. And like RP said, only 3% of healthcare expenditure goes to mental health services, and only 5 outpatient mental health clinics, 2 of which are only for children and adolescents, are present in the country despite internal and external efforts to modernize mental health care. Treatment regimens are not regularly updated, and research remains underdeveloped. Yeah, so I was searching up research for Armenian population, and it didn't come up with a lot. So these are the things that I found.
All right, excuse me. As you just mentioned, yeah, there's not a lot of information on treating Armenians, especially Armenians here in America. But from what little is out there, this is what was suggested. Like the biggest model for treating Armenian people was using transgenerational assessments. Well, first, 90% of Armenians in America are the offspring of genocide survivors, and most of that is from the Armenian genocide of World War I, which, not to get off track here, but for anybody who ever has a chance to read about that, you should, because it was absolutely horrific. The only reason it gets overshadowed is because of the Holocaust of World War II, but what happened to the Armenians was absolutely horrible in World War I, and that has carried over transgeneration. It's carried over since then. And the Armenian earthquake of 1988, which is, that's not a war or political, but it caused a lot of destruction and displaced a lot of people, and a lot of people ended up coming over here to America because of that. But part of the transgenerational assessments is genograms and the use of genograms, and that is to help the client understand the family history of mental health and trauma of what their family has gone through over the last however long, 100 and some years, and to help the therapist identify possible examples of resilience or coping mechanisms in the family or community. Because even without mental health services or professionals helping people, when a group of people goes through something traumatic, they're gonna naturally develop their own ways of dealing with that trauma, and then the resilience and trying to get past it and things like that. And not always, but most of the time, those things tend to be pretty effective, and it's a good way to find information on how to help clients to get past what they've gone through. There's something called the ADAPT model, and it's the adaptation after persecution and trauma. And it's basically to study how community trauma, and that's because you have personal trauma, family trauma, and then trauma for the whole community. And the ADAPT model helps the therapist and client to understand how that trauma has impacted the community, and then has trickled down into that person's family and in their personal life, the emotional effects of all those things. Rapport, and that may seem kind of basic, but it's very important. Many, I don't want to say all, but many Armenians, at least here in the United States, they have a certain distrust of non-Armenians, and especially non-Armenians associated with large institutions, government, the healthcare industry, maybe, because that's a large institution. And a lot of that is due to the forced displacement of their people. And then there's a lot of people out there who just deny that genocide even happened. And yeah, that causes a lot of undue trauma on this population of people. Continued. Community resiliency factors, implement known community healing and coping strategies. Like I mentioned before, these are things that were naturally adapted based on the trauma that people have gone through over the years. And as a therapist, you implement these instead of solely implementing Western oriented approaches. Because most likely that's what they're going to respond to, obviously. And an example would be having group therapy or family therapy in a community site, possibly, a religious site or the family home, maybe even, and then using resiliency-based language, because resiliency is a big concept in the Armenian community, like I mentioned, based on the things they've gone through before. And yeah, being resilient is something that they have to embrace in order to keep, in order to survive and keep moving forward. And I wrote options here. This is, and I failed, I apologize, I should have put down the link, but for anybody who lives in Los Angeles, there is a place called the D.D. Hirsch Mental Health Services. And I'd never heard of it, mostly because I don't live in California, but they have a program called Our Immunity, and that would be a combination of community, Armenian, and they provide counseling, substance abuse treatment, community support groups, access to doctors who, are more in tune with the population and their culture and things like that. So.
And these are our references and our discussion questions. In what ways can we decrease the stigma of mental illness to the people of Armenia who believe that mental illness is a punishment from God? How can mental health professionals work to provide culturally responsive care for Armenians given the importance of cultural values and beliefs in shaping attitudes towards mental health? And what can be done to reduce mental health stigma in Armenian communities, and how might this impact rates of mental health service utilization? And we also posted a handout on the wall. I think Arpi posted it. So if you want to take a look at that, that kind of just pulls everything from our presentation together in one piece. So thank you guys.
Yeah, excellent presentation. Excellent. Great job. Questions from the class? Anyone has questions? Anyone familiar with Armenian community?
That's the question I was going to ask, like, who exactly are the Armenians and where are they located and how specific are they to America? Because I never heard of this. Is my first time ever hearing of this. And I actually...
well, Kim Kardashian and Cher are both Armenian.
That's what I was just going to say. I actually did some looking up on some stuff while they was doing their presentation, and Kim and her sibling both grew up with the Armenian culture. Their dad was Armenian, and they're trying to honor his legacy since he died in 2003 by, carrying on the legacy of what have you. But I have never heard of Armenian. So could you explain a little bit more of who they are and where they are actually from?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in real quick. I should have mentioned that earlier. From what I read, there is roughly 1 million or so, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, total Armenians in this country. Like I said, they may have gone up or down. And from what I read, most of them are on the West Coast. But I mean, that, they could be spread out all over the country. But from what I read, a lot of them are on the West Coast. And I'm not sure exactly where the main population. Okay, this is really ignorant. I just know I'm not an expert on Armenian culture either, or the Armenian population. It's just what I read from the World War I class, but a lot of it was over in Turkey, and they got pushed out. The Turks are the ones who caused the genocide against them. I can't remember if Armenia is a separate country or not, or if it's, yeah, so I apologize. Somebody might be able to answer that better than me, but.
I mean, maybe, Kashev, to simply kind of understand it is, think before the 90s, before we called Russia, Russia was United Soviet Socialist Republics. It was USSR, right? So you remember all that. After 91, Russia got broken up into many countries, right? And those countries you hear about now all the time on the news. One of them happens to be Ukraine, right? And we say other countries would be places like Georgia, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia is one of them, right? So there's several different countries, Belarus. So Russia basically got broken up into smaller countries, and Armenia happens to be sort of a region that came out of that, like an independent state that came kind of out of that. Before that was controlled by Russia. So you could kind of think of it like that. And in terms of the genocide that happened, one of their neighbors are Turkey. So Turkey was part of the Ottoman Empire. And the Turks, I think, were responsible for killing over 1 million Armenians, during World War I. So that was one of the things I was going to ask you, Kyle. Maybe you know a little bit more. You seem to be sort of like a history buff. How much does the genocide that took place in World War I sort of affect all the generations after that in terms of sort of having a mindset of always beating challenges, like you say, resiliency, like using language of resiliency, right?
Mhm.
Maybe seeing that, you know, coming sort of, we could say, equated to a lot of Jewish communities of sort of understanding that we come from a struggle, right? We come from being, some things have taken place, in which case we've beat some struggles throughout history. How important is that now in the context of the modern communities of Armenians? What kind of happened with having over 1 million of their population decimated?
From what I read, I mean, I can't like put a number on the degree of how it, you know, how much it affects them, but it still affects this group of people even today. I mean, you mentioned a minute ago, you know, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, they're the ones who caused this genocide. And I don't know, it hasn't been mentioned in a while, but I've heard in the last several years, you know, there were some American politicians who were standing up in Congress bringing this topic up. And I was sitting there thinking, you know, why are they bringing up the genocide from 100 years ago? You know, I mean, we're so far removed from World War I. Well, Turkey's trying to get into NATO. And the reason why they were bringing it up is because the Turks, even today, still deny or try to minimize their involvement or the reasons or everything that was going on behind that genocide. And the American politicians were trying to get them to admit it. And that's kind of leads to where, you know, it was mentioned earlier in the presentation that, you know, Armenians in the United States anyway, are a very tight-knit group and very untrusting of other people around them. And a lot of that is because of the denial, you know, I mean, just the I mean, you're talking about something that's going on for over 100 years and people are still denying it, you know, and you can tell, I mean, from what little I researched on it, I can tell it's still, it's kind of a knife in the back, if for lack of a better term, you know, I mean, you even see it with the Jewish population today. When you hear people deny the Holocaust from World War II, it just sends some people into just a rage, you know. And it's so, as far as the Armenians with, it's still a big factor. And then the resiliency part of it is a huge concept in that population of people. So it's very important.
Okay. Great. Any other questions from the class?
Yeah, I had a question because I find it very alarming how they treat children with mental health issues. Did you all come across any like prevalence rates for child abuse within that community?
I didn't see anything specific to abuse in the research that I was looking at. I think honestly, based on at least the readings that we did and looked at, I would lean more towards neglect versus abuse, just in terms of like, there's a mental health issue going on that's not being attended to in the way that it needs to be. But I don't know, did anyone else in my group, do you guys see anything about that?
So I think there's no like certain percentage of how many children are experiencing abuse, because I think from what I read, it's more like in general, since the mental illness is shame to the family, so most of them are kind of hidden. So that's why I put maltreatment and violence against children with mental illness. It just goes back to like bringing shame to the family. That's why it doesn't come out as much.
Thank you.
And like what we said a while ago, like the research on it is like really minimal.
I kind of want to add a bit to that. I think it depends on location as well. Armenians who live in America are more open throughout the years to kind of, get their children treatment. But back in Armenia, I was actually there this last summer for 2 months volunteering, and I was the only person out of 200 people who were there that was volunteering in like the field of psychology. So it's very needed, but since there's a lack of knowledge and like throughout the generations where they don't have the necessary either like therapists around to go ahead and get educated on it. So I think like for us it seems like neglect, but on their end it's just something that they're not aware of. So if they had more awareness like individuals here do, I think they'd definitely go ahead and take their children to kind of get assessed.
Okay, anybody else? Any other questions? I think the largest community outside of Armenia is the Los Angeles area, like LA County, for Armenians, right? For those of you living in LA right now, do you experience interactions with many Armenians or?
There's a really large Armenian population in Los Angeles. And from what I know that actually they really like love the Kardashians because the Kardashians have shed a lot of light on their culture that like before not a lot of people knew about the Armenian population and the culture. But in Los Angeles, there's like Glendale is like a really like big like city that a lot of Armenian people live in, and there's Little Armenia and like just really good food. And I don't know, I actually have met a lot of Armenian people since living in Los Angeles.
Yeah, actually, most of the ones I know out there, I know quite a few. They seem to be doing pretty well. Yeah, most of the ones I know. All right, so in terms of the entire community, you say there's deemed to be a lack of perceived need for treatment for anything, right? Or perceived need that there's an issue. And you may alluded to that being maybe due to religious beliefs or spirituality or something of the sort. Did you kind of find that to be the case? Like, do you think religion ties into them not identifying that there's a need for any sort of mental health treatment or that there are issues to begin with?
I think I can like speak on like experience. I think growing up, you're not really allowed to express emotions, specifically negative emotions. So like if there's a problem, there's like a saying where I feel like every child has heard is when you grow up, you'll forget about it. So kind of just don't think about it now. So they have like the whole like spiritual like evil eye where if anything goes bad, that means someone, put a bad eye on you, and you immediately it's like go to church, light a candle and pray, and that's going to solve like all the problems. So I think because of the whole background history of Armenia and their people, there's that distrust of others, and they kind of stick to their own community. And since their religion's kind of like a big part of their identity, they believe that like praying and lighting candles and all of those kind of things are gonna have more of an effect.
All right, so basically what you're saying, tends to be a mindset or ideology that things are more external than internal. That yes, in some way that it's more due to external factors like fate and outside forces as opposed to personal introspection or reflection or trying to improve self. That may be kind of more of the mindset, you think?
Yeah, definitely. From like everyone that I know, that seems to kind of be the theme going on where even like me, like personally, I'm always told, you have everything you need. So you shouldn't be feeling a certain way. And if you're feeling that way, it must be due to something else.
Okay. All right, interesting. And how do you think what all of you have learned in this research dealing with Armenian populations, if you were to come across someone from that population and have a challenge of trying to get information to sort of help treat an issue, how would you go about sort of handling that from your research? What are some of the key takeaways you can use to help you in your therapy with an Armenian?
I found like a couple things that can like help. First would be understanding the culture and like the beliefs, like the importance of family, respect for elders, like the role of religion in life, and then also building trust and rapport. So that's like a big factor. You're not really going to get anywhere with an Armenian client until they trust you. And then address the stigma, where I think you could do that through education, because as I mentioned before, they're not really aware of like mental health and the resources that they can use. So in their mind, it's still, there's that stigma of like mental health equates to shame and a bad light shed on the family. And then also incorporating cultural values and practices. For example, the therapist can encourage the family involvement therapy sessions or integrate religious practices and beliefs into treatment as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. That'd be interesting to see how that would go. Yeah.
From my research in this project, I think my biggest takeaway is just like extremely heavy emphasis on the rapport building stage of getting to know an Armenian client, because that will sort of set you and your Armenian client up for like the most successful process, regardless of where it goes. But that seems like the trust and the sort of initial connection and sort of setting that relationship in the right place is what's really essential.
You think you can build the rapport by maybe like an intake process, or before that, just by learning a bit about the history, the culture, the geography, the layout, that type of stuff will help?
I think that would definitely help, but I think you would need to as well sort of really be connecting with that person on like in an individual level, and how they like personally see the values that are assigned to their culture, the values that are assigned to their identity. Maybe they're an immigrant, maybe they're a child of an immigrant. However they see their identity within that culture, I think will be a really key component, along with sort of having some background as well.
I kind of want to add to that, where you had just mentioned like history. I think kind of validating their feelings on their history, because a lot of Armenians feel anger most of the time because they've gone through so much, and it's like they help everyone else, but when it comes time to when they need help, they feel like no one's there. So like even to like, I think it's been 3 years ago, there was like another war that was happening at like the border, and that's like people's like cousins, brothers, family that they're losing like on a daily basis. So it's like there's not much communication. So there's like a lot of emotions that they haven't been taught to process or kind of accept. So I think like starting on that end and then slowly getting to that individualized like therapy sessions would probably help, because majority of the time they just want someone to like validate their prior experiences and how that's affected them and their character development.
Interesting. I think outside looking in, kind of the generalization I can maybe even relate to Jewish communities is that you have a country with population that heavily identifies with a religion that is different from the predominant areas they're surrounded by. Right? Armenia will be probably mostly Orthodox Christianity or Catholicism, right? Surrounded by a host of, Islamic countries, right? The same could be said for, say, Israel. So that there could be a relation there of sort of the mistrust and the close-knittedness of that society, even from a geographical or environmental perspective, of almost saying, hey, we are kind of surrounded by people who completely disagree with our values and belief systems. Therefore, we have to really be super duper tight knit as a community in order to survive. If not, we may face some sort of genocide because of that, and we probably have in the past. So this is interesting looking at it from even, you could say, a geographical or historical context, sort of why certain value systems and traditions come about. All right, anything else? Any other questions before we get out of here? All right, looks like we're not going to have time for, to go through the PowerPoint, but I'm pretty sure everyone's kind of read everything they need to read to understand the material. So next week will be our last week. So unfortunate, gonna miss everyone. But yeah, everyone's done excellent in the class, so no worries. And we'll just catch up then. Maybe we'll leave the last hour to just talk about some random stuff next class. We don't have to talk about class stuff. So I'm not going to hold you. You got 1 minute left, so I'll let everyone go, and I'll see you next Tuesday. All right, see you. Bye-bye.
Professor, I have a question. On my paper that was not the paper that's due tonight, but the paper before. I did my paper on disabilities, and the person that I'm doing the interview on is quadriplegic, but they also have dementia. So I can't get my interview all the way done. So I was wondering if you had any advice.
Oh, so with dementia and quadriplegic. I say just, that's a very interesting, topic. And I think that's very unique. And so what you can do is maybe write in also some of the expressions of the dementia, meaning like, at what point do you feel maybe some of dementia kicks in versus other points where you feel like maybe you can extract some real information from the person? Maybe write in some observations that you made about that. I mean, were you able to get any things?
I have some, I have some good points, but the thing is with the dementia, it's like when you're talking to her, she'll have like 5 minutes where it's like nothing's wrong with her, and she can tell you a lot of stuff, but it's like within that 5 or 6 minute span, she like goes into childhood.
Oh, okay. I mean, there's something that you can also write in too. You could say, I as interviewer, made observations that there were expressions of kind of childlike language or verbiage or something like that. I mean, that could be part of your paper. So it's not only just maybe writing, questions and answers and what you learn from that, but also the different expressions in those answers, like what you observe within those answers to be like, oh, that was interesting that this was kind of expressed childlike, or in a child way. I maybe say, yeah. And then that's the best you can do for getting all that for that particular individual, I think that's acceptable, because you're trying to get information from somebody who's extremely challenging to get information from. But I would just say, yeah, try to write in observations that you notice as well too, during the interviewing process. And then that way it kind of will make more sense, on terms of maybe the actual answers you receive,
All right, thank you.
Okay, cool. I'll see you next week, Ashay.
Have a good night.
You too.